Hello, everyone, and welcome. I'm going to give everyone a minute to get signed in. While we're waiting to get started, I'll do introductions and take care of a few housekeeping items. I'm Jessie Beringer, Head of Marketing for 3D Group and the Study Coordinator, and I'll be facilitating our session today. Looks like people are still popping into the room, so maybe I'm going to give us just another moment.
Sure, let's make sure we get everybody.
Yeah, let's make sure we got people in here. Okay, welcome, everyone. As you can see, we've got a chat box. I'm sure everybody is pretty familiar with the workings of Zoom at this point, but feel free to ask us any questions throughout the presentation or let me know if you have an issue in the chat box and I'll be helping you with that. So joining me to discuss the results of our latest study is 3D Group President, Dr. Dale Rose. Dr. Rose is the founder of 3D Group and a nationally recognized expert on talent assessment, leadership development, and 360 feedback. Dr. Rose personally coaches top-level leaders in focused post-360 feedback sessions and also more long-term coaching engagements. While he most frequently works at the executive and C-suite level, he's supported leaders at every level from board chair to first-line supervisor. In addition to his coaching work, Dr. Rose is a widely published author in academic journals and an author and co-editor of the recently released Handbook of Strategic 360 Feedback. He's also a frequent contributor to publications such as the Wall Street Journal, Financial Times, and HR.com. So again, as I mentioned in the beginning, we'll be answering as many of your questions as we can at the end. Feel free to ask me questions using the chat function throughout the presentation. So with that, thank you all for joining us today for 360 Feedback Practices Revealed, Insights from our latest benchmark study. And with that, I'll hand it over to Dale to get started.
Thank you, Jessie, and thank you all for taking a little time to learn about what companies are doing in 360 feedback. I'm excited to be here. Always love looking at data, so we'll be doing quite a bit of that today. Worth pointing out, this is our 6th edition. We've been doing this study for quite a long time. One sort of truth in advertising, so to speak. 2020 was an interesting year for all of us. And so one of the things that was real interesting for us is this was the year that we actually released the study originally. It turns out that we released it right around the end of March, where people were pretty busy doing other stuff. So we thought it would be useful to review and revisit the data and really think about it in the context, of course, of what's happened in the most recent year, but then what's coming as well. So what I'd like to do is to go back to kind of what was the practice, and really most of this data were collected pre-COVID, so pre 2020, right around the end of 2019. But it does give us a really good sense of kind of what common practices are. So I'm going to go through and share what those are and share what the kind of broad themes are. So as we look at the data and we think about kind of past research. So as I mentioned, we've been doing this for quite a long time. Our first study was in 2002. And we collect the data periodically. Every year, the practices in 360 don't change year to year to year to year, but about every 3 or 4 years, we're collecting data. And we've evolved our methods over time. So just a little bit about that methodology. Initially, the first study we did involved in-depth interviews. We ended up with, I think, about 55 companies. And we spent a lot of time really digging in, understanding exactly what people were doing step by step. But we realized that method was a little bit limited, and so we were trying to expand the breadth of companies we covered. We started using survey-based tools. That produced some great data generalized across lots of companies, but it also left us a little bit not as rich as we wanted. So the last couple of years, we've kind of blended the two, and I think we found the happy medium here to get a broader base of companies, but also a deeper dive and making sure we understand some of those responses. So what we did was survey people, and then we followed up to make sure we understood what some of their answers were and clarified where there were questions. We ended up with a sample of 100 companies across many different industries, and pretty broad sample, a mixture of our clients and not our clients, so certainly not biased by our own methods by any means. And as you'll see, sort of large companies and small. So when we look at the sample briefly, everything from 25-person companies all the way up to 120,000 people companies, big and small, pretty well spread around as well, not concentrated in any one group. And then in addition, pretty good range in terms of experience. There were certainly, first-time users, but also folks that had iterated their programs a few times, and then folks where this is just really part of their business and they've been doing it for a long, long time. So we feel like we had a pretty good, stable sample of companies that are going to reflect kind of current state of what decisions employees make, HR folks make when they're building their 360 process. When we write up this report, and if you don't have a copy of the full report, certainly reach out to us and we'll be happy to get it to you. We add in a bunch of color around why would you make this decision or make that decision. And we position all the data around the decisions that an HR talent leader would be making as they go through in developing their program. So I won't be covering every data point today, but I will be highlighting kind of the big takeaways and covering a pretty good sense of it. The thing that we find more than anything when we look at the data kind of across is there are some increasing benefits. There's an increased, not just usage in terms of quantity, but also quality. So one of the key insights that we find when we looked at the data broadly is more feedback. So people want more feedback, more employees are getting feedback, more employees are giving feedback across larger numbers of leaders. So and individual contributors as well. So we do find that there's an increased kind of demand, if you will, for feedback, but also with more populations. Interestingly and encouragingly, better feedback. So when we look at this, and you'll see it as I go through the data, organizations are making decisions to improve the quality of their feedback rather than just trying to get as many reports to as many people as they can. There's a real attention into what's the quality of that feedback, how valuable is it, and what can we do to make it better, more reliable, more valid. And then also encouraging is the notion that beyond the report is important. So it's, any of you that have implemented a 360 process know it can be complicated, it can be time consuming, and in many ways, you get to that point where leaders get the report and you think, whew, I did it. Our orientation is, well, that's the moment where you start. Now you've got the feedback, doing something with it was the whole point to start with. Encouragingly, more and more organizations are putting time and energy into that after feedback moment. Not just getting the report, but then getting use out of the report for those leaders. So we're going to see these three trends, and I'll highlight them as I go into the data, but hopefully that kind of broad view will be helpful. So let's start with the more feedback. So one thing that we found was that 360 is showing up in more talent programs. So certainly back in the late 90s, mid 2000s, 360 feedback by itself was a thing. We have a 360 feedback program. That's it. Nod to Carol Timmerick, we have a 360 feedback process, might be the better way to think about it. And I think what we're seeing here is that, in fact, it is more of a process that's implemented in many talent tools. So what we see, if we go back to 2016, is maybe there's more of just, we have a 360 program. Still less than half the companies just doing it as a standalone, but that number really shrinks as we're moving into the 2020s. And so what we're seeing is more and more that 360 is being incorporated into multiple, as many as 5 different talent programs within an organization. The multifaceted nature of the tool is really critical. So what kind of programs are they being integrated into? We identified 5 and asked specifically whether they are being embedded here. So we see is a real spike in the on-demand sort of when you need feedback, not necessarily on-demand, click, do this on your phone, but 360 feedback available when the leader needs feedback or wants feedback themselves versus going through a standardized process where it's going to start in May and it's going to end in June for everybody. So a little bit more of that flexibility around when feedback is delivered, but also a big spike in terms of use for leadership coaching, kind of a natural segue. And then also formal leadership education. We're seeing, and we had a great chapter in our book on this around how you can embed and incorporate 360 into a leadership development program to make it much more, I would say, personally relevant, right? So if I start with a feedback report that has feedback for me about where I can develop as a leader at the beginning of a leadership program, I'm going to be much more focused in that program on the things that are relevant for me in that day. So we were I will say, a little concerned about the on-demand notion, and is it just really kind of willy-nilly, or is that and is it a standalone program or not? We dug a little deeper. We found, in fact, what was happening is that this big chunk of almost 3/4 of the companies doing ad hoc or on-demand employee feedback, really that number is a little bit smaller. So what they're sort of saying is, we're going to do this for when people need it, but we're also going to embed it in another program. So that number may be a little bit smaller when you think about it being in multiple different programs at a time. The other sort of more feedback trend we found is more leaders participating in feedback. So when we look at the data here, we kind of split it according to level in terms of managers, executives, et cetera. And we find, when you look, a lot of numbers here, but again, across time going back, there really is sort of an increase across the board here, where more managers, more executives, even more individual contributors are getting feedback. The kind of all employee, everybody gets feedback is pretty stable across time, and then same thing with all leaders. But there definitely is this notion that we want more of our managers to get feedback, which is encouraging. And I think in particular, early and lower level managers getting feedback, hopefully in a constructive way, can help make feedback part of their leadership journey as they do get higher into the organization. If you start only with executives and you don't work on that leadership pipeline from a kind of feedback discipline, or discipline around getting feedback, it may be a little harder to get them on board. So again, more leaders participating, getting feedback, very encouraging. Also, though, the employees who are providing feedback actually jumped a fair amount. So the profile that we typically see is one you might expect if you've been running your own program, sort of self, boss, call them direct manager, direct reports, and peers is kind of your standard. Pretty much everyone is getting feedback from those groups. Less so customers, but not zero. And then kind of this catch-all other category is used to some degree as well. But indeed, the notion that more programs are seeing all of these kind of core areas as opportunities to provide feedback, and trying to expand that group. So, from our perspective, we like seeing these numbers. I think this is right. It was a little surprising that it was in the kind of high 80s prior. So great to see that increase for sure. Now, as we start thinking better feedback, what does better feedback look like, and how can we improve the quality? So it's one thing to get lots of feedback to people, but we've got a lot of data in the world. We don't necessarily need more feedback. I know there's I've even written a little bit about this notion of continuous feedback. All the kind of case studies we're seeing are showing that the notion of continuous feedback, and you can get a little app that gives you feedback, isn't really what managers need. They're getting feedback. What they need is that moment to stop and look at it and actually do something with it, and think about it and integrate it. They need better feedback. So one of the ways to get better feedback that we know works in the literature is through rater training. And so one of the questions we ask is around, well, what do you do to train your raters to make sure they're giving quality feedback? We've actually done some research to show that when you look at the text, open-ended comments, that's where some of the least valuable feedback is. A little counterintuitive, but the quality of that feedback tends to be a little bit thin. When you incorporate it with the numerics, with someone who can interpret the both together, can be very powerful, but the qualitative alone isn't necessarily quite as high quality. In any case, training raters to provide that feedback actually can increase the quality of those open-ended, but also the variability that they use when they're using the ratings, so you don't end up with a whole bunch of 5s or a whole bunch of 1s on a 5-point scale, but people actually use the range. So we know rater training works from the literature. A lot of different ways to provide rater training. What we're seeing here is rater training is on the rise, in almost every format. I think the fact that no training is dropping and people are realizing at minimum, you can provide some good guidelines in text that really give people the idea of how to approach the rating. This is not a Yelp rating, right? This is a performance rating. You're observing behavior. It's much more complex, much more nuanced. So being better at giving higher quality feedback rating is really important. Um, Interestingly, I think this is one of those data points that we really look forward to seeing in 2022, because my guess is that right now, well, certainly if we had done the study and collected the data in 2020, the teleconference or video training probably would have spiked, and the in-person training would be close to zero. So I think in some ways good that we didn't collect the data in 2020. But I think in 2022, it'll be interesting to see how the work shifts and whether that really changes. From my perspective, again, the key message here and the real encouraging data are that the attention to helping raters be better raters is clearly there, and companies are looking for multiple different ways of approaching that problem. The other thing that we've seen over the years, and certainly experienced, anybody who's filled out a survey, I remember back in the day, there were, you wouldn't 360 surveys, were not uncommonly in excess of 120 items in an effort to get all 30 leadership dimensions or something along these lines. Clearly, in this day and age, that length of survey, there's just no tolerance for it. But survey length becomes important, because if you don't have a long enough survey, 3 items, is that enough? 4? No, you really do need, leadership's complex. You need some amount of detail in there to make it a valuable, rich exercise. Well, our recent data was suggesting that there was a real trend kind of downward. So the prior study was seeing really very short studies. As it turns out, I think what we found in thinking about this and reflecting on it, and then doing some of that follow-up interview inquiry, it turns out that these kind of really short 1 to 20 survey and 1 to 20 item surveys tend to be, I think, really around the trend that popped up right around 2016, 2015, around, hey, let's get rid of performance ratings completely. We don't need these. Now, it turns out that trend is not really stuck, that there are still some companies trying to figure out how to fix performance management. That may be a permanent activity, an ongoing effort. But the idea of eliminating ratings has not really been successful, because at the end of the day, you're making a judgment one way or another. Good performance, very good performance. Am I doing a rating or not? What we're seeing is that the data are really reflective of the fact that there were performance management surveys. So if you're doing 360 for performance management, that tends to be quite a bit shorter. But if you're trying to develop as a leader, it's more complex, and it tends to be quite a bit longer. So while the overall average is around 46 questions, when you split it by program type, it tends to land right around 50 questions. And so I think that's a worthwhile data point to consider and to think about when you're looking at survey length. Always a balance between too short, too long. But I think you want to make sure you're getting enough coverage that the feedback is valuable for folks. Other ways in which feedback has gotten better, if you will, more rich, has to do with the reports themselves. So if we look at the report elements, right? A lot of different elements you can put in a report. And if you've ever looked at a range of different feedback reports from different feedback providers, it's incredible the amount of data that you can put into a 360 feedback report. We asked companies, well, which elements are you including, kind of by items, by competencies? How are you comparing groups? How are you looking at variability? And you can see here that in each of these cases, there were really pretty sizable increases in the different elements. So I think what we're seeing here is that reports are probably getting a little more complex, including more ways of looking at the data. I think encouraging that we're getting report reading tips. This is a little bit of that, getting better quality, but also doing something with it. The development suggestions sort of followed from the data, also pretty useful for guiding, giving people notions of what do I do with this feedback. Um, but again, the broad message here is we're getting reports that have more rich information in them. I think interesting to think about kind of what is that core profile, right? What's the standard 360 report? When you look at these data, certainly looking at the average score by competency, pretty core, basic element. You also want to look at each item. What we find in coaching folks is that sometimes a competency score will hide one individual item that's critical, right? So you get really high, acts with integrity scores, but it turns out you get a really low score from your manager on follows through and commitments. That one little score might be the point of the report that you need to focus on. So I think it's key that people are recognizing the value of digging down into the items. Now, how you sort those, do you report them separately by rater group? That's going to vary a little bit, but making sure those items are in there. I think, the idea of comparing groups, absolutely central to 360 feedback. If you look at kind of our definitions in our book around being able, the one thing 360 does better than any other instrument is it helps you see the world from different points of view. So getting an overall score on a 360 isn't necessarily that useful because it's going to kind of all mush together. But being able to see how your peers see you differently from the way your direct reports see you, from your direct manager, all these things and these differences are where the real value is. And so we see that being a pretty common approach. Still a little lower than I would have anticipated in terms of being in the kind of 50% range. But certainly the blind spot analysis does make some sense. Variability gets very tricky for folks. Understanding variability, I think, is something best done with a coach. It can be tricky. You don't certainly want your leaders asking who said what, in terms of looking at frequency distributions and that kind of thing. But again, understanding that you have maybe a bimodal distribution on a feedback item. Maybe a leader looks at something like micromanaging, and half their direct reports feel they're great on autonomy and the other half feel they're not. Well, understanding what is that and do I have that dial right could be really critical. So I think variability is one that's really key. And again, we're seeing those reports getting richer, I think, with more detail, which is encouraging. Probably the single best, and it still befuddles many of us in the field, but the single most kind of hot topic, if you will, in 360 is should it be used for development? Should it be used for decision making? We've tried to put that to rest for a long time. The short answer is yes, it should be used for both. But at its core, it's clearly a development tool first. And yet at the same time, you have so much rich data. Why would you not incorporate that into key decisions? Colleagues of mine would also point out that, frankly, you are incorporating it in key decisions. So let's take a look at the data on it and how companies are using it. So we ask, how do you use the data? What's the kind of purpose for the 360? Clearly, to kind of cut through some of these numbers for you, clearly development kind of continues to be king, again, as a core purpose, right? It's critical that if your people are giving a leader feedback, it's just critical that there be some development component to it. But again, I would look at this as kind of a yes and this is very much the way the question's asked, is which of these? It's not one use, it's many uses. So yes, of course, the leader's getting development, but also we want to be able to look at those data and inform the succession plan so that we're not promoting somebody or putting them in a spot when they're not even yet able to delegate and they're still micromanaging, and we just increase their scope of responsibility. So you want to make sure that you're looking at the impact a leader's having on the people they're working with, certainly before you put them in a spot to take on more responsibility. So I think that succession planning item certainly stands up. Again, performance management, all these various different quote unquote decisions, I think are areas where companies are using the feedback. Is it ubiquitous that they're all using it? Well, certainly not. but I think where companies can, they are trying to incorporate the tool and the data into decision making. My guess is that a lot of this, again, reflects what I was pointing out before around it's a little complex to understand a 360 report. It's very difficult to get a singular item that really reflects the complexity of a leader, especially across raters. But if you can, in a succession planning conversation or a talent review, unpack a little bit of that, it can be really valuable. Um, so another way to sort of think about that then is to go, okay, well, for decision making, what kinds of decisions might a company be using the data for? What we find is when you unpack it a little bit, that sort of self-directed, here's your report, it's yours, use it however you want, really is not what people are thinking about when they're thinking about using it for development. They're thinking about, use this for real planning. Let's use this to figure out what training courses you need. Let's use this to identify what development areas you need to focus on. And sure, we're gonna sometimes use it for core decision making, but again, almost always including some sort of development. So this is the group of folks that are saying we use this for decision making, and here's how we use it for decision making. Again, the message being development is a component of it, even though there are other aspects as well. So when we start thinking about beyond feedback, right, this starts suggesting that there are ways beyond just that individual report and off you go. One of the key steady findings that we've hit every single time we've done this is that 360 feedback is not just about a report and a survey. Often, again, building the process, you're focused on what's our competency model, what are the items, is it valid, is it reliable? The work and effort that you put into to make that process effective is critical, but where the value to the organization comes in is when use happens. And so I think this is why consistently we found that some sort of follow-up support, working with an individual one-on-one is consistently going to be a component of a 360 process. Again, that's going to vary depending on usage and volume, and companies have come up with all kinds of creative ways of doing 360s at scale, but still giving somebody a third party or at least a neutral party to come in and work with them on their feedback. That could be an internal coach from the HR group. You can train your managers. But the idea being that if you just land a report in front of somebody and say, there you go, there's your feedback, the likelihood of getting the return on investment with them taking that feedback, understanding it, putting it in context, and then coming up with an aligned plan that's really going to make them a better leader, that's just a very difficult journey to take on your own. So I think companies have realized that the ROI of having someone take just even an hour to really work with them on a report to truly understand what they can do with it. Reading through the report ought to be clear enough and easy enough, but they ought to be able to actually make sense of it, and not just sense of it, but then what do I do with this should be that conversation. So pretty consistent findings here that we're seeing that. The other thing is, and again, we've seen, with the advent of these things, you get this idea that you might get feedback all the time, the continuous feedback idea, that you can make feedback quick and easy, and we've just seen again and again and again case studies of these things not really quite taking hold the way the promise of them might be when you look at the screenshots and look how quote unquote easy it is. And so I think what we've seen is that 360 feedback really has stood the test of time because of the value it brings. And indeed, when we ask, how much senior leadership support is there for the process, we find that's actually, even pretty steady and if anything on the rise. I think it's critical to recognize that leadership is the responsibility of leadership, right? If HR is taking over on your 360 process, certainly from an implementation and a design standpoint, they need to be there. But if your senior leadership is not embracing feedback as a way for leaders to develop and improve, you're going to have a really hard time getting it off the ground. And I think what we're seeing is again and again, that's not the case, that in fact senior leadership is driving it most of the time, ideally even driving content and jumping in there, head first. So great to see that it's kind of, there's a lot of support for the process. We've, as you see, tons of data points here, right? We've asked lots and lots of data points. We thought it would be interesting to also ask companies, well, okay, so what are the essential components? If I'm starting off, there's so many things I can build, so many things I can do. I can make this process super complicated. What does it kind of boil down to? So we gave this huge laundry list of all the different components and asked what was essential to you. And what we found, and we asked, it wasn't it was a pick all to sort of see which things people identified as essential versus nice to have. And perhaps not that surprisingly, kind of the top cluster and the number one, I think, was anonymity of raters, the core of the process. We talk a lot, one of the kind of three legs of the stool is credible data, right? If I'm getting feedback about myself as a leader and I don't believe the data is honest, what are the chances I'm going to spend any energy on it? And even if I do, am I actually going to be aligned with developing something I ought to develop? So I think that anonymity becomes the critical component, that people can speak their mind and trust that that anonymity will be there so that the leader will hear it and use it. So again, not surprised. That one-on-one feedback debrief, again, people see as just critical from a value perspective, not just critical, but essential. This is like, you can't get value without it level kind of support. I think developing the content is the second leg of that stool. Is content that's relevant, content that fits the leaders, content that fits the context. Really essential. Self-ratings surprise us a little bit. We've seen a lot of folks kind of, well, the self-ratings matter. Well, the reason self-ratings matter is less about what are my ranked top to bottom for myself and more about, well, how does my view compare to others, particularly blind spots. We find leaders all the time get blind spots. Very frequently, they just think they are, really not doing what they should be in one particular area, and it turns out people think they're superstars. They need to be lifted up in that zone. They also may find there are places that they thought they were perfect and actually they had room to improve. Thinking that you're great at something when you have room to improve in the eyes of others, you've got to resolve that in one way or another. Maybe you're right, maybe they're right. Some sort of resolution needs to come to pass there. Again, open-ended comments we hear again and again, people really valuing that. A report that you don't need a PhD to read. Meeting with a boss is absolutely, just such a value point. Not necessarily around the report. It could just be, here are my key takeaways. Help me with that. There's a big value opportunity for organizations to get people's direct manager engaged in the development process through the 360. Again, it doesn't have to be the report. It can be the report, but at minimum, it ought to be what those key top three takeaways are. And then again, getting leadership support, not just from HR, but from the frontline leaders who can illustrate. So these are kind of, if you're putting together a program, these are the things that I would start with as, make sure you get these built in. This is where the value is going to be. This is what those 100 companies are telling you are going to make the kind of the biggest difference. The next set gets, maybe a little bit less essential. The lowest one being around, a formal orientation for completing raters. I think in these days that actually can be done much more efficiently. We're actually seeing quite a few of these being done now, just recorded video like this, and then you push it off, which makes it a lot easier to accomplish, less scheduling and things like that. So there can be some value in that, but I think the effort has perhaps been historically a little challenging. I think we can move up the numerical results here to be seen as more valuable than they are if we make our reports better, and if we're making sure those coaches are focusing on them. So these are kind of the point of view of where to start. Now, the other aspect we wanted to look at, and we're constantly thinking about, is kind of the evolution of 360 feedback, and how does the 360 feedback practice sort of show up in organizations? Where is it adding value, and what's the kind of character of it? And we'd like to see 360s being more strategic, not just be about an individual leader and their feedback, but move on to more of how can we lever these data across the organization for things like succession planning, talent programs, leadership programs, things along those lines, where the individual is getting data, but the organization is getting data about the talent of its leadership and able to manage that group well. So we looked at kind of each of the different groups of different levels of kind of what the profile might be of a program, and we kind of found these five different levels that emerge. So the first kind of least strategic level of using 360 is user driven, right? It's that, hey, I want to get feedback, let me go get it, I'm going to go find this report of that. Not really any HR driven process at all. It's just individual leaders getting feedback from wherever they can. Maybe they've got a coach that's having them do a 360. And I think HR managers recognize this happens. This happens in organizations maybe a quarter of the time. The better version, the more strategic version, is at least having an HR-driven process where there are guidelines, there are guardrails. This is our process. Maybe indeed you do it, at a self-pace when it's appropriate for a particular leader. But at minimum, if there's a 360 needed, HR's got kind of control of what those guardrails are, and that's obviously the most common approach. So there is a tool, it's available, but it's not just willy-nilly. We also see a lot of program-driven usage, right, where a lot of companies are, 57%, just as many as have that kind of guardrail-oriented approach, are using it also as a program-driven process. So embedded in a leadership program, used as a first-time manager. Every first-time manager 6 months in gets a 360 and a coach to work them through. The more even further strategic level is this kind of purpose-driven approach. Great chapter in our book on this around, let's say you want to shift your sales strategy and you want to move in a totally different direction. What's your sales leadership look like? You can go in and evaluate the talent of that team from an ability to make a shift in a direction you want to go by getting all those leaders, the 360, aggregating the data up, try to understand, can we make that shift or not? So I think having a clear, almost episodic but purpose-driven approach to why you're implementing 360 with a particular group can be a really strategic focus. And then even fewer companies, but still, a small, a sizable minority, I guess, are seeing 360s in a business-driven way, as in this kind of feedback is just what we do. It's part of our core, the core experience of being a leader here is you're going to get feedback on a regular basis. We're using it to make talent decisions. We're using it and embedding it in everything we do. It's just sort of part of what it is to be a leader in this organization. You got to expect you're going to get feedback and get it on a regular basis. So obviously we'd like to see that kind of elevate up in terms of the strategic level, but we're encouraged that there's a lot less user-driven than some of these more strategic and more value-added approaches. So that's kind of the big picture. Like I said, the report itself has a ton of data in it, much more detail. I'm happy to kind of move on to some questions, but first a plug for an event we're doing later, I guess actually in a couple weeks here. We have a strategic 360 forum that we have been doing now for I don't know how many years, but it's an opportunity for organizations like yourselves to meet with each other and share best practices and share current struggles and work with each other. So we're really there to facilitate that conversation. We've got a couple of great companies, Shutterfly, American Century Investments, who are going to share their experience, but there will be a fair number of opportunities for you to share with each other kind of what your challenges and thoughts are and work with each other on how to think about how to implement and get more strategic in your approach. So with that, I'll turn over to questions. And I'm wondering if Jesse, you might have gathered any in the chat, which I've not been paying attention to, but I bet you have.
Yes, thank you, Dale. We do have a couple questions, and if anybody still has a question, feel free to type it in. So the first one that we got was, I know you don't have data on this right now, but what do you think are the effects of the pandemic? What would the data look like if we had done it in 2021 or if we did it right now?
Yeah, well, the pandemic was an interesting thing for 360, I think. What we saw in kind of anecdotally and in our own experience was that certainly early on, really first couple months, most companies were trying to figure out how to operate in this environment. It took a couple months, I think, to get to just a baseline of how to do that. And so I think there was little feedback early on. I think then, as things wore on, people were a little more open to feedback and recognizing that leaders have been an incredible amount of strain the last year. And so understanding, well, how well am I doing? Really, that more of that development rather than evaluative, I think is where we saw the value and the benefit for leaders for most of last year. And then toward the end of the year, there was a real focus on, wait a minute, we need to make sure we have solid leaders here. I think succession planning became way more, salient in people's minds. And I think there was a real shift toward trying to level up the quality and rigor of assessment, and particularly informing succession and talent. So I think that, it was a bit of an odd year in that regard. I wouldn't certainly look at any data specific to last year. Our take is that as we're starting to see this year evolve, and we're getting kind of more and more out of the crisis mode, if you will, that feedback and kind of there's a real reinvigoration of the need for development and looking at how am I doing, because I think particularly for leaders who didn't get enough of that, and it was sort of an odd year, it's kind of like, okay, now things are a little bit more normal. I'd like to get some feedback and really build on strength rather than just get through. So I think we're seeing a lot of it increase. But it's our sense is, and with this part, I will collect data next year, is this year will be a transition year as we're getting into hybrid models of work, and every company's trying to sort out, is it all remote, is it whenever you want, wherever you want, is it all back? As that starts to shift and the way we work shifts, I think so too 360 will shift, and we'll see a shift in particularly things again like rater training. Frankly, I would expect kind of a spike, even though we're already pretty high up there in the use of one-on-one coaching, because now it's so easy to do it in a virtual world. So I think this interaction space is going to increase the quality and the ability of us to deliver 360s in a much more fluid way, and make this kind of resource available. So I would see rater training getting better, probably some video orientations on the increase. That should be more common. I think the feedback coaching will be increasingly virtual, and therefore increasing to a broader number of leaders. I would say those are probably the three big ones.
Great. I saw this a little bit when you were talking about evolving the process, but what trends do you see emerging in terms of people using 360 feedback in their high potential programs? How are
Hmm.
they using the data, and sort of where does it fit into the program process?
Yeah, so any sort of high potential program, almost universally, I think ought to include a 360, because again, if you're looking at a high potential and you're trying to elevate them, they got to understand kind of what they're building on, what they're taking with them, and when you're going to do a role transition, rules are going to change, and it's a difficult transition to make. So I think understanding yourself becomes a critical part of being kind of that high potential. We're actually seeing some interesting data. We've done some stuff. We haven't quite been able to get to doing the actual codifying and writing up and productizing, if you will. But we've seen with a couple of clients some pretty impressive correlations between 360 feedback scores and observed high potential. So our sense is that actually high potential can be predicted with 360s, and I would see this as a way that companies will increasingly actually lever it to improve their diversity and inclusion. Because if you've got, instead of kind of I know somebody in the informal networks, if you've got a broad assessment strategy that can identify high potentials, which 360 seems to be able to do, there's some real opportunities there for identifying high potential in places you might not already see it.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us today. I hope we'll see some of you next week on the 6th at the Strategic 360 Feedback Forum. If you have any questions about that, just reach out to us. And we'll be following up with all of you to make sure that if you don't already have a copy of the study, you have one. So thanks so much for joining us today. If you want to talk about your individual 360 process with Dale and members of our team, reach out to us through our website, or you can call us at 510-463-0333. Thank you all again. I'm sure you can all use an extra few minutes in your day, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.